Hey, so I had an idea for a video where I would basically talk about how I would put together a gaming PC or any PC for that matter and build it because I see a lot of people on Rich at Review Tech USA's streaming. When he streams, the in the chat, there's a lot of people asking, well, what do you think of this PC part? Or what do you think of this PC builder? Should I upgrade this? Or what should I do? So I thought I might just do a video on, maybe how to figure out how to answer those questions yourself because he gets bombarded with those questions. You can't quite answer all of them. So actually, I end up going in there and answering a lot of them, but it's really quick because I only have to go through one website to do it. But before I do that, I thought it might be best to make a quick video here. Let me adjust my mic on what the components of the PC are, or of a PC are. So, I'm going to use my trusty whiteboard here. First thing, I'm only going to cover the three main components. This is basically how it is. You've got your storage. Make sure that's in the frame good there. Yeah. Which we'll call the storage, which can be your hard drive or your solid state drive, whichever you have, and I'll get into that in just a minute. And then you have your RAM, which is the computer's main memory that it keeps intact. Now, can I be heard? Yeah, I guess. Yeah, I got a good signal on the mic even from here. Just making sure. I'm still working out on the bugs in my presentation, or at least with what I have to work with anyway. And then the third part is the CPU, or the thing that actually does all of the processing. And the data, when you're running your computer, runs in this direction. It starts here where everything is stored. And then it comes down here into the RAM, which is another form of memory, but it's much faster. Basically speaking. So I guess what we can do is sort of call this like a holding area for data, because make sure I'm still in the frame there. Yep. Holding area. Because we can't just take data and process it directly from the storage, and I'll explain that why that is not a good thing to do in a minute. And then the CPU does all of the work. Now, this is basically how it is. If you're building a gaming computer, however, then you also would normally have something called a GPU, which is for graphics. That means I'm going sideways here. I need to get this thing mounted on something. That's for graphics. Now, the way this works is instead of taking all of the information for anything that appears on the screen, any video that has to be shown or rendered on the screen, instead of having the CPU process all of that, we then take it from this RAM and put it in here and have it do that. And the GPU actually has its own RAM, but we don't really need to get into that too much at the moment. We will in a minute. Okay, so this is basically how it is. Now there are other components of the computer, like you can have the motherboard, or short MOBO. You can also have the power supply unit, but none of these, in my opinion, really affect how the computer processes data and how fast it is. Also, you might have an optical drive or a deep, and no one really puts a disk drive in their computer anymore. But if you do, sometimes you'll have I'll just put a disk drive, maybe. But none of these really affect what happens here. All right, now one of the things to consider when you're trying to put together a computer is how fast each one of these components is working. Okay, now for instance, in the storage, and I've got it. See, now I'm going to have to edit this video because I have to get my laptop out for this because I don't have the numbers off the top of my head. Just a second. Okay, got that all set. All right, so when you're selecting what your storage is going to be, there's obviously the size of the storage, which most people, when you're building a computer, are savvy enough to know that a terabyte is bigger than 512 megabytes. So there's that. But the other thing to consider is how fast the thing is going to be able to transfer data from itself to the RAM. And that depends on what type of drive you have and how the drive is connected to the motherboard. So there's basically three types. Again, basically, I'm not going to get into all the technical jargon because nobody wants to hear that anyway. Matter of fact, this is probably getting too technical for some people as it is. But anyway, there's the HDD, or hard disk drive, which is a mechanical drive that has a magnetic disk inside of it that spins around and stores the data magnetically. It's basically magnetic media like tape. And there are things that will affect how fast that works. How fast it spins is one thing. But normally if you're getting a hard disk drive these days, because they're mainly out of style at this point, you're looking at maybe 7,200 RPM, which is a lot faster than it would have been 10 years ago, but technology has progressed quite a bit. So hard disk drive, which were always connected with this cable that was called, and it still is called, SATA. And then if it's modern enough, it's SATA version 3. And you can't see that because that's out of the picture. Let me wipe that out. Okay, let's try this again. Now I can write over here. Whoop. we'll go ahead and say HDD for hard disk drive, SATA 3. Okay. And then also there's what we now know as solid state drives, SSD. Now, SSDs can also hook up via SATA 3, but there are also SSDs that hook up via a PCI slot, PCI Express slot, PCIe for short, on the motherboard. And so when you're choosing a motherboard, of course, that's one thing to consider. What sort of slots does it have? And the website that we use to decide all that will tell you if you've screwed that up anyway. So now, why do we care about this? Well, number one, basically, without getting too technical, hard disk drives operate much slowly than solid state drives. Solid state drives do not use a mechanical spinning magnetic media. They use what's called, technically speaking, it's called non-volatile memory, which means that when you turn off the computer, it doesn't lose anything. It's all stored right there. Unlike the RAM, which is basically a holding area, as we said, for the memory or for the data. Once you turn off the computer, this gets wiped out completely because it's constantly transferring data from here to here. And then once the thing shuts off, it doesn't work anymore. Requires power to work. So, we have, that thing is going out. So one thing you want to consider is that there's a difference in how fast each one of these can transfer information from here to here. So HDD SATA, simply speaking, can go 100 megabytes per second, thereabouts. My marker's not working too good. If you have a SATA SSD card, you're going to get 600 megabytes per second. Now, if you go and you research this, you'll discover that how long is this video going here? There's no way to know. No way to know yet. Oh yeah, 12 minutes. There it is. If you do some research and you go by what the actual bandwidth of the cable is, you'll find that it's a little bit more than this, but there is some, what's the word for it? Basically, you can't get the full bandwidth out of the cable. So this is generally what we end up with. That. Now, if you have a PCI Express slot with a solid state drive in it, because you're not using the SATA interface, which is a lot slower, now you're using PCI Express. Now we can get much faster. Now we're talking about actually 3.9 about gigabytes per second. Not megabytes, but gigabytes. That's 3,900 megabytes if you want to convert it. You just multiply by 1,000. By the way, something you want to be on the lookout for. If you're looking at components specs and you see this with a little b, that means gigabit. Not gigabyte. Only if it's a large b does it mean gigabyte. And so what's the difference? Well, there's 8 bits in a byte. So to make that conversion, you just multiply by 8 or divide by 8, whichever way you're going. Okay, so there's that. So yeah, there's the different speeds. So if you're wanting to build a computer that can access information very quickly, you want to look for this and then get a motherboard that has that slot. But I will say the computer that I have built actually has a SATA 3 solid state drive. I believe it's the 870 Evo from Samsung, the 1 TB. Even though it's significantly slower than this, it still feels a lot faster than my old computer, which just had the standard hard drive hooked up with SATA 3. So there's still, even if you're going with this, it's not the end of the world. You're still going to be running pretty fast. Okay, so let's go to the RAM, things to consider. Now, RAM usually as referred to as in the type of RAM anyway we're using these days is DDR, which stands for double data rate. Not that anyone cares. 4, which depending on how the manufacturer made it, can be transferring at 17 gigabytes per second, a lot, or 19.2 or 21.3 or even faster yet 25.6. I'm running out of room there, which and it's also hard to read, yeah. But yeah, if you look at the when you're looking at RAM, it doesn't tell you the transfer speed though. It tells you the clock speed, which is proportional to the transfer speed. So if it has a higher clock speed, it's going to also have a faster transfer speed. So it can go anywhere from clock speed 20, well, normally 2400 megahertz to 3600 maybe. I know 3200, but I think I've seen 36 out there. So, and again, the difference between this and this is I honestly don't know, because I don't have fast RAM in my computer. I just know that it is faster. Whether or not it's a negligible factor, I'm not sure. But that's why you see different speeds, and why you see different versions of DDR4 RAM will be more expensive than others, because it's not so much the amount of RAM that's costly, it's how fast it is. All right, so our data. So then we go to the CPU, and you might have asked yourself already, why can't the CPU just access information directly from the hard drive or the solid state drive or wherever the storage is? And the answer is because if you look at this, even if we're going 3.9 gigabytes per second here, it's still significantly slower than the transfer speed of DDR4, which at minimum is going to be 17. So if you try to go from here to here, you're going to be bottlenecking your system, because the CPU can actually handle information faster than this is giving it. And then the simple answer is because PCs just simply aren't designed to do that. So I need to drink a coffee here real quick. Okay, so we've got all that. Now I'm going to erase some of this. CPUs, I'm going to erase this too. So CPUs have 3 main characteristics that everyone tends to look at. The first one is the speed, or clock. The other one is the number of cores it has, and the other one is the number of threads it has, if applicable. Sometimes there are CPUs that don't have multiple threads per core. Okay, so the the only thing that you really have to understand is that if a CPU has one core, that means it's going through basically one, it's basically only doing, instead of doing one operation at a time. Granted, it would be very fast. Like for instance, a lot of CPUs these days are in the 3 gigahertz range, which means millions upon millions. I'm not going to get the exact number. Millions upon millions of calculations per second. So if a CPU only has one core, that's what's going on every second. However, let's say your CPU has more than one core. Let's say it's got 2 cores. Well, that means it can take information to one core and then information also to another core at the same time. And so it continues for each core that you add to it. Okay. Then also sometimes there are multiple threads per core. I'm going to put a dotted line here. So let's say this particular computer has 2 cores, but each core has 2 threads. Well, what that means is sometimes when, basically speaking, sometimes when a CPU is, running the numbers, there's idle time here and there. And that's where we can take advantage of using more than one thread. So during that idle time, sometimes, and this is dependent upon how the programmer has programmed the software that you're using. We're talking about hardware right now, not software. So the CPU can then take on 2 pieces of information at a time per core, because it can handle 2 things at once, be in between, sharing that idle time that goes on. And that is basically just a more efficient way of processing information. Let's see. Let's go down to the GPU. So like I said earlier, the GPU will handle all things that you see on the screen. It renders all of the video, especially if you're playing a video game. What's happening is every frame has to be rendered in real time. And the game, the computer doesn't know what it's going to be because you're controlling the game. The camera goes, all different directions in most games. Pardon me. In most games. So the GPU has to be encoding and rendering that on the fly. So that's why it's better to have a separate processor doing all of that. But in the meantime, GPUs actually have their own RAM to make things even better. And so what happens is the information gets pulled from here and bypasses the CPU and goes into this holding area. This is all the, oops, that was my fault. Goes down into here, into the RAM, where the graphical information is stored until called upon by the GPU. Now, how much RAM, of course, this is the thing that you look at, everyone looks at when they're selecting a GPU. How much RAM, how many gigabytes of RAM does it have? And generally today, most cards will have at least 4 gigabytes of RAM, and then there's 8, and some of the bigger ones have 12. So that's basically how it runs. We go from storage to RAM to CPU and or GPU. And, these are all of the characteristics. I had to erase that one, but the characteristics of each component. So in my next video, I'll probably go into, okay, so how do we select what parts we're going to get? And I didn't want to do that in this video because this one's already gone over 25 minutes. And I think that's long enough. And plus, I'm not sure if I want to do that video tonight because I don't want to get burned out. So this is the 21st century father struggling to get his recording room organized and struggling to end a video. I hate ending videos. I never know what to say other than just goodbye.